So in this video, we're going to look at doing some simple object animations right within a blueprint. So in this example, this is a great way to animate, say, a collectible that you're going to place throughout the level that maybe spins or moves up and down. This could also be a great way to animate, like if you have a big floating mass of crystals or something that goes up and down. This could be a good way to approach that. Previously, we looked at using the um, sequence editor to animate an object, but this is another option we have to us that we can do directly inside of a blueprint. So to get started, I'm just gonna go ahead and create a new blueprint, an actor, call this test, and I'll open it up and we'll get started. So here's my, oh, too big, too big. Right, here's my blueprint window. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to go over to the Event Graph tab right here. This is where we can, start to build some blueprints to have stuff happen when we press play in the level. So we're just going to be using this event begin play. So I'm just going to move these out of the way. So first thing we'll do is we're going to add a cube to the scene. So I just press add and add a cube. Now if we go back to our viewport, we can see we have a cube in our scene. And I'm going to go to my event graph and we'll get started. So first thing we need to do is define a couple of variables that we'll pull from throughout the script, to go through everything. So first thing we'll do is we're going to pull the cube in. So I just drag and drop the cube. And we're going to drag out from it and we're going to get world, if I can spell, world rotation. So now we're sampling this cube's position in the world, or rotation in the world. Then after that, we're going to go over to this variables tab. We're going to add a new variable. And so when we press add, we can now rename it. I'm going to call this cube underscore initial rotation. And we're going to change the variable type from a Boolean to a rotator. So with that good, we can now, any of our variables we can drag into the scene, and we're going to set the cube initial rotation. And we're going to plug in our world rotation. So now, if we plug this execution into here, we're now saying when we play the level, set the initial cube rotation equal to the current rotation of our cube. So now with our variable set, we can go into the next step. So if we pull off here, we can search timeline and we can add a timeline, and I'll call this transforms. So what a timeline lets us do is it lets us define how some values will change over time. So if I double click this, we'll open a new tab. That's our transforms in the timeline. And what we need to do is add a track. And we're going to add a float track. And this just means it's like a single value that'll change over time. So by default, it looks like the scene's 5 seconds long. So we can, let's see, let me go back to the event graph. Oh, right up here, length, you can define how long the timeline is. We're just going to set it to 2 seconds for ease of use. So for this one, since we're rotating, we're going to add 0 seconds. If we right click, add key, up here we'll get time and value. So at 0 seconds, we want to be at 180 degrees. And then we'll right click at, oh, we did this wrong. We did it backwards. Let's Control Z a couple times. Add a track, add a float track. We want it to be 2 seconds. 2. And then add key. Okay, and then at time 0, we want the value to be 180. And then we'll right-click again at the end. And then at time 2, we want the value to be negative 180. Now, for the sake of a rotation, this should kind of loop on itself. So there we go. So back in the event graph, you'll now see our new track appears as an output. So the next step we need to do is, out of the update, we're going to go drag out and we're going to put set new, or actually, let's see, set world rotation. So we'll search set world rotation, and then we'll see set world rotation and then cube, which is referring back to our cube in the scene. So we'll grab this, and you can now see we have this new node. The target's already plugged into a cube, which is referencing this guy. And now we'll say on the update, we'll plug that in. So now as this plays, it'll update the new world position. So last thing we need to do is just plug in those specific values. So to do that, we're gonna start by right-clicking on this new location and then split struct pin, which will switch it from all 3 values being combined into one input to breaking them up into X, Y, and Z. Then we're going to go ahead and grab our cube initial rotation, drag it in. We're going to get the cube initial rotation. Then we're going to right-click on the cube initial rotation words, split it as well. So now we also have the X, Y, and Z values. And now what we can do is we can plug in the X, plug in the Y, and then we can take our new track and we can basically add the value of this to our value of Y in our initial rotation and plug that in. So last thing we'll have to do is we want this to loop. So let's see what it does as is. If I go over here, drag our new one into the scene and press play, it spins one time and then stops. So we want it to keep on spinning. So we'll stop that. And what we can do is, if we right click and type in reroute, we can add a reroute node, which is just a little spot to, drag off of. And we can take the finished, plug it into the reroute node, drag the reroute node, and plug it into play from start. So it's a little hacky way, but this just says when it's done, do it again. So let's run through what we got. So on event begin play. So we press play in the scene. We're going to set the cube's initial rotation, and we're going to define that by getting the current world rotation of our cube. After that, we're going to plug it into a timeline, which has a value moving from negative 180 to positive 180. And we're going to take that value and we're going to add it to the Y value of to the Z value of the cube's initial rotation. And then finally, we'll update the cube with that new rotation. So let's compile, let's save, and let's have a look. So now, if we press play, our cube, it spins. And that's the initial thing. So we love having controls available to us that we can adjust on the fly. So let me stop this. And we're going to add a quick control. So we know that this new track output is what's controlling the spin. So the rate at which this moves from negative 180 to 180 and how fast that's added to the Z value is how fast it spins. So if we want to give ourselves a little control, we can drag this off and we can add a multiply in. And this is a similar, concept that you'd use in the material editor. And then if we go to the variables, add a new variable and call this cube rotation speed, set it to a float, which is just a single number. We can now drag in the float. We can get the float speed, plug that in, and then plug this into the add node. So now before this enters the add, we have one more kind of spot of interaction. So if we click on our variable here, we want to set the default value. And when you make a new node, you'll see down here under default value, it'll say, please compile the blueprint. So you got to compile it, and then it'll let us set this. So we're going to set it to 1 by default. And then we can go up here and we can see instance editable. So if we check this and compile and save, if we go back and look at our cube, give it a click, we'll look in the details panel and we'll see right up here, we'll see cube rotation speed. So now with our cube rotation speed variable set up, we have the default value at 1. We have instance editable turned on. Now if we go back to our scene and press play, right now I have it set to 10. If I stop it, set this back to 1, and press play again, we can adjust that speed on the fly. So if you don't want to have this control necessarily, you would basically change the speed of the spin by going back to your track and adjusting the the length of the track in the timeline. So here we would basically make it over 5 seconds instead of 2 seconds, so it just has more time to get through its thing. So if you just want to set something up and you're not really going to change it, you would just play with these values to get what you want. So that's, on a basic level, how you would animate an object. So now let's say that we have multiple objects in our scene. So in our case, let's add another cube. And we'll just have it called cube 1. We'll go to our viewport and we'll drag it up so we see a different one. So if we have multiple objects, we will have to set a bunch of new variables and basically add on a new world rotation if they're still going to rotate. So first thing I'd have to do, if I wanted to add more objects to this whole setup, is I would take my cube 1, I'd drag it in, I would pull it out, I'd get world rotation, I would go ahead and make a new variable, I would call this cube 1 initial rotation, I'd set it to a rotator. I'm basically copying this variable, but this one's specific to cube 1 instead of cube. And then we'll drag this in and we'll go set. And we'll kind of add it in between here. So now when we press play, we're going to set 2 variables. We're going to set cube 1's initial rotation and regular cube's initial rotation. So after we set our 2 rotations, it goes into the transforms. And then afterwards, we have a couple things to think of. If this cube we also want to rotate, we could utilize the same output. Like if it rotates at the same rate or a similar rate, we can use the same output or maybe even the same rotation speed. But let's say it rotates on a different axis. So if I right click over here and do set world rotation, I see set world rotation cube 1. And now it's the same setup but for cube 1. Plug this in, right click, promote to struct or split struct. Then we'll drag in our initial rotation. We'll get it. We'll split struct. And now, so this one's rotating on the Z. Maybe this one I want to rotate around the Y. And just for the sake of ease, I could drag this out, create a new multiply variable setup so that I could have them rotate at different speeds. And that's what I recommend if you want some, finer control. But in this case, I'm just going to use this same one because I want them to rotate at the same rate. So if I adjust the speed of one, this way it'll affect both. And now we'll drag this off and we'll add. So this time we're going to keep the X the same, but I'm going to plug the Y into the add node. So we add our new value, plug that into the Y, and Z into the Z. So we compile, we save. Now if we go to our scene, we have our new cube here. And when we press play, we got 2 cubes spinning. So you can kind of repeat that process for as many objects as you have, or as many objects as you need. Keeping in mind, what do you want control over? And for each thing you want control over, you make like a new variable. This is like creating a parameter in a material. Add like a multiply to up the speed and go from there. So last thing we'll look at, again, you could stop here. It's just a matter of how far do you need to go, is I want this whole group now to move up and down as a whole. So think now we're moving like the whole blueprint together. So to get that started, we need a couple things. So we already have this default scene root in the scene, and we can use that. That's basically what everything's parented under. So if we move this in the viewport, so if this moves, it'll bring everything with it. So let's set another variable, because we can drag this into the scene. We have the default scene root, but this time we're going to get world location. So instead of getting the rotation, we just are getting the XYZ location. Then we'll go ahead, same process, we'll make a new variable. We'll call this root initial location. Except instead of a rotator, we're going to set it to a vector, which is just a X, Y, and Z value combined. Now we'll drag our new variable in. We're going to set it. So we'll plug that in, and line it back up. So as you can see, before we get to the timeline, we're just adding new sets, to set as many variables as we need before we get to this end section. Now it can start to get complicated and kind of cluttered, but if you just keep yourself organized and really think about, all right, so I'm going to have all my variables set up. Maybe you stack them all together like this, so each little set is one thing. You can start to group things together and just keep yourself organized. And then maybe over here, maybe you just give yourself some more space in between them, so you know what nodes go with what, which ones are associated with one another. So just, take the time to organize and keep things together. So we have our new variable. Now this same track we had is no longer going to work because we just want this to move up and down, and moving it from -180 to +180 could work, but we're going to look at how we could just add another value. So if I open my timeline again, I can go up and add a new track, and we'll add another float track. And we'll just leave it new track 2, but you could always name them for clarity. We still have it set to 2 seconds. And for this one, I'm just going to make sure my starting location and ending location are the same. So we're going to right click, we're going to add a key, and at time 0, we're going to have a value of 0. and then we'll go to halfway, and we'll add another one. So at time 1, we're going to have a value of 100. So it'll go up 100 units. And then one more key at the end. At time 2, we'll have a value of 0 again. So we go start 0, up, down, they end and begin at the same place, so it loops. So we have that. We can go back to our event graph, and you can see when we add a new track, we get a new output. So if you don't want your nodes to like cross, like the lines to cross, you can just right click and go add reroute node, and that'll add this little guy, which you can then bring in. We can add another one, add reroute. That way you can just have things, keep them a little cleaner, just so it's more clear what goes to what. So now we have the second value, and we're going to do the same procedure, but just grab a slightly different node. Because now we're going to set world location instead of rotation, and we're going to set the new location of the default scene route. So we'll click that. You can see we have the kind of same situation going on. Again, we want to control the different coordinates independently, so we'll right click, we'll split it. So we got the X, Y, and Z. And then same process, we're going to grab our root initial location, we're going to get it, we're going to split it into the X, Y, and Z, and then I want my object to go up and down on the Z. So I'm going to plug in the X, plug in the Y, because they're not going to change. And then I'll take my value from my timeline here, from my new track, which I rerouted down here. And we'll do an add node. I'm going to add it to my Z value and plug it in. And we'll compile, we'll save. Now, when we press play, we have our two cubes. They're moving in their own directions, and then the whole thing's moving as a whole. So that's kind of the workflow to get your objects moving within a blueprint. And definitely, get used to using blueprints. They're very powerful and an excellent tool within Unreal. So after you're done, to stay organized, definitely start just moving stuff around, keeping them grouped together. I always like to keep them, give yourself a little space. You can always do the good old highlight everything, press C to put a block around it. So I could call this set variables. And then I can just say, I can put a frame around each little section and call this cube rotation. Cube 1 rotation. And then I can call this overall transform. So now it just helps organize it a little bit so you don't get overwhelmed if you come back with all sorts of, spaghetti going on. So that's Blueprint to make an object move. Give it a go.